Soviet citizens stood frozen in disbelief, eyes wide as they encountered the gleaming metal box on a Moscow street corner during the summer of 1959. The machine, a self-service Coca-Cola vending apparatus, hummed quietly, its vibrant red logo a jarring splash of capitalist color against the austere Soviet landscape. For Americans, these ubiquitous machines represented nothing more than convenient refreshment, a mundane feature of their consumer paradise. But for Soviets witnessing this strange contraption at the American National Exhibition in Sokolniki Park, it embodied something far more provocative, an alien economic system where machines served individuals on demand, without queues, without paperwork, without the mediation of state employees. The simple act of inserting a coin and receiving a cold bottle of Coca-Cola, a transaction completed in seconds, challenged decades of Soviet economic orthodoxy more effectively than any political speech ever could. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The confrontation between American vending machine culture and Soviet consumer reality would become one of the most visually striking yet understudied theaters of the Cold War, a battleground where ideology manifested in the mundane. The story begins not with presidents or premiers, not with missiles or submarines, but with the humble coin-operated dispensing machine and a carbonated beverage that would become America's most recognized commercial ambassador. By the mid-1950s, the United States had embraced automation in daily life with unprecedented enthusiasm. Vending machines had evolved from simple gumball dispensers into sophisticated mechanical salesmen capable of delivering everything from sandwiches to stockings. For American consumers, these machines represented the perfect marriage of technology and convenience, a quintessentially American innovation that promised service without human interaction, available 24 hours a day. By 1955, over 1.8 million vending machines dotted American streets, offices, factories, and schools, generating annual sales exceeding $2.5 billion. Coca-Cola led this automated revolution. The soft drink giant had recognized early the potential of vending machines to expand its market presence, installing its first automated dispensers in the 1930s. By the mid-1950s, the company operated over 450,000 vending machines nationwide, making Coca-Cola the most accessible branded product in American history. These red metal ambassadors of American abundance stood sentinel on nearly every street corner, in every office building, beside every gas station, mechanical promises that refreshment was never more than a few steps away. Meanwhile, across the ocean, citizens of the Soviet Union inhabited an entirely different consumer universe. The USSR's planned economy approached distribution from a fundamentally different philosophical starting point. Consumer convenience ranked far below industrial production in the hierarchy of Soviet economic priorities. Shopping meant navigating a fragmented system of specialized state stores, each dedicated to a single category of goods: bread shops, milk shops, meat shops. The concept of self-service was virtually unknown. Most Soviet stores operated on a three-stage system, where customers would first view merchandise, then place an order with a clerk, and finally proceed to a cashier to pay before returning with their receipt to collect their purchase. Nikolai Bailov, who worked as an economic planner in Moscow's Municipal Commerce Department during the 1950s, would later recall, "The idea that a machine could replace a sales clerk seemed not merely capitalistic, but almost offensive to our understanding of commercial relationships. Commerce was supposed to be a human activity governed by state planning. The notion that citizens would interact with machines rather than workers, this was difficult to comprehend ideologically. This philosophical divide over something as seemingly trivial as how to dispense a beverage revealed deeper tensions between competing visions of modernity. The Soviet system emphasized collective consumption through communal facilities. The American system celebrated individual choice exercised at the moment of desire. Soviet citizens drank kvass from communal barrels, wheeled through city streets, or shared carbonated water from a common glass at street corner dispensers. Americans dropped coins into personal dispensers for individually packaged drinks consumed alone. When Nikita Khrushchev assumed power after Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet Union entered a period of relative openness. Khrushchev, eager to demonstrate that socialism could compete with capitalism in providing consumer comforts, authorized increased production of household goods and allowed for greater cultural exchange with the West. This thaw created an opportunity for the first significant cultural contact between ordinary Soviets and American consumer culture. The perfect vehicle for this encounter arrived in the form of the 1959 American National Exhibition in Moscow, a sprawling showcase of American technology, art, fashion, and daily life. Housed in Sokolniki Park, the exhibition was the American half of a cultural exchange agreement signed by the U.S. and USSR in 1958. The Soviets had mounted their exhibition in New York. Now it was America's turn to display its achievements in Moscow. The exhibition was designed to impress through abundance rather than exceptional luxury. Its organizers sought to portray America as a land of middle-class prosperity rather than elite extravagance. They created a vision of attainable affluence, dishwashers, television sets, and washing machines that supposedly sat in ordinary American homes. And scattered throughout the exhibition grounds were dozens of vending machines dispensing free Coca-Cola, automated ambassadors of American hospitality. Howard Jensen, one of the American guides at the exhibition, remembered the Soviet visitors' reactions. They approached the machines like they were encountering alien technology. There was hesitation, disbelief. They would watch Americans use the machines first, then try themselves. When the bottle dropped down, cold and ready to drink, their faces registered something between delight and suspicion. Many would look around as if expecting someone to stop them or ask for documentation. The exhibition became famous for the kitchen debate, an impromptu ideological sparring match between Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in the model American kitchen. But while leaders debated washing machines and television sets, ordinary Soviets were having their own revelations at the Coca-Cola machines. The concept of self-service was revolutionary to us, recalled Mikhail Gorbachev, who visited the exhibition as a young law student before his rise through the Communist Party ranks. The idea that you could approach a machine, deposit a coin, and receive a product without human intermediation, this suggested a very different relationship between the citizen, the state, and the economy than what we were accustomed to. For the Coca-Cola Company, the Moscow exhibition represented a tantalizing opportunity. Despite its global reach, the iconic American brand had never penetrated the Soviet market. Cold War tensions had kept Coca-Cola, perhaps the most recognizable symbol of American capitalism, firmly outside Soviet borders. The exhibition offered a chance to introduce the product to a vast, untapped market of potential consumers. The company shipped 30 vending machines to Moscow specifically for the exhibition. These weren't ordinary models, but specialized units designed to impress. Each was equipped with a rapid cooling system to ensure that every bottle emerged at the perfect temperature, a technical marvel in 1959. The machines dispensed approximately 3 million free bottles of Coke during the 6-week exhibition, introducing the beverage to an estimated 2.7 million Soviet citizens. Soviet authorities permitted this capitalist intrusion with obvious reluctance. Initially, they demanded that Pepsi Cola, which had no presence at the exhibition, be offered alongside Coca-Cola to demonstrate American choice. When exhibition organizers explained that Pepsi and Coca-Cola For competitors who had never shared dispensing equipment, Soviet officials seemed genuinely confused by this aspect of market competition. Valentin Berezhkov, who served as an interpreter for the Soviet Foreign Ministry, later wrote in his memoirs, "Our officials could not understand why two companies producing essentially the same product would refuse to cooperate in its distribution. This revealed a fundamental disconnect in how our systems viewed commercial relationships." The Soviet press received instructions to downplay the popularity of the Coca-Cola machines. Pravda mentioned them only in passing, describing them as mechanical curiosities that dispense sweetened carbonated water. Yet photographs from the exhibition tell a different story. Long lines of Muscovites waiting patiently for their turn at the machines, sometimes for hours, to experience both the novelty of the dispensing system and the unfamiliar taste of the American beverage. Alexander Bronfman, who was 12 years old when he visited the exhibition with his parents, would later immigrate to the United States and become a history professor, specializing in Cold War cultural exchange. He recalled, "The Coca-Cola machine represented a kind of freedom we couldn't articulate at the time. It wasn't political freedom exactly, it was consumer freedom. The freedom to approach a machine and make a transaction without oversight, without authorization. For a Soviet citizen accustomed to having every economic activity mediated by state employees, this was revolutionary." The machines created logistical challenges for exhibition organizers. Many Soviet visitors, unfamiliar with the concept of vending machines, would take their bottle but leave the cap on, unsure how to open it. Others would collect their Coca-Cola, but then stand blocking the machine, savoring the moment and preventing others from using it. A team of American attendants had to be stationed near the machines to demonstrate their use and ensure smooth operation. The Soviet response to the actual taste of Coca-Cola varied widely. For some, it was too sweet, too strange, a symbol of capitalist excess in flavor form. Others found it immediately appealing. What remained consistent, however, was fascination with the delivery method. Marina Volkova, who worked as a translator at the exhibition, noted the psychological impact. People were not just tasting a new beverage, they were experiencing a new relationship with commerce itself. The machine didn't judge you, didn't require connections, didn't care about your social status or party membership. It was radically egalitarian in a way that our system, despite its ideological claims, was not. The exhibition concluded in September 1959, and the Coca-Cola machines were packed up and shipped back to America. But their impact lingered in the Soviet imagination. The brief exposure to automated vending created a persistent cultural reference point, a glimpse of an alternative approach to consumption that many Soviets found compelling. Soviet leaders recognized the propaganda value of American convenience and began exploring limited experiments with self-service in the early 1960s. The first Soviet self-service grocery store opened in Moscow in 1960, directly inspired by American examples. Soviet engineers began developing indigenous vending machines, primarily for dispensing carbonated water, though these remained relatively crude compared to their American counterparts. Georgy Tsipursky, who worked as an engineer in the Soviet Ministry of Food Industry, was tasked with developing Soviet vending technology in the early 1960s. He faced significant obstacles. "We could replicate the mechanical components easily enough, but our system was not built for the kind of maintenance these machines required." In America, private companies had economic incentives to keep their machines functioning. In our system, responsibility for maintenance became a bureaucratic question with no clear answer. The most successful Soviet vending machines dispensed gazirovanaya voda, carbonated water, for a single kopeck. These machines became ubiquitous in Soviet cities during the 1960s. However, they operated on a fundamentally different principle than their American counterparts. Most featured only a single communal glass that users would rinse briefly under a small water jet before use. The machine dispensed unflavored carbonated water for 1 kopeck or water with syrup for 3 kopecks. The technical simplicity and communal nature of these machines reflected the Soviet approach to consumption, centralized, standardized, and collective. Coca-Cola, meanwhile, continued its global expansion elsewhere, largely excluding the Soviet bloc. The company focused on developing markets in Western Europe, Latin America, and Asia, creating a global footprint that increasingly contrasted with the Soviet Union's isolation. By the mid-1960s, the red Coca-Cola logo had become not just a corporate symbol, but a shorthand for American global influence, a visual emblem of capitalism's worldwide reach that stopped conspicuously at the Iron Curtain. The absence of Coca-Cola and its distinctive vending machines in Soviet daily life became a symbol of difference, a visible manifestation of the separation between the First and Second Worlds. For the growing number of Soviet citizens who traveled abroad as tourists, diplomats, or performers, encountering Coca-Cola machines in foreign countries became a reminder of their distance from Western consumer culture. Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space and a Soviet national hero, visited Copenhagen in 1962 as part of a goodwill tour. Photographs from this visit show the cosmonaut pausing before a Coca-Cola vending machine, examining it with evident curiosity. The image captures a poignant irony. The man who had orbited the Earth confronting a mundane technology that remained foreign to his homeland. The cultural significance of vending machines extended beyond Coca-Cola. Throughout the 1960s, American vending technology expanded into new product categories: hot coffee, sandwiches, cigarettes, candy, and eventually hot meals. These innovations reinforced the American commitment to convenience and immediate gratification, values that contrasted sharply with the Soviet emphasis on collective provision and planned distribution. James Warren, an American business journalist who visited Moscow in 1963, observed this distinction. In America, we've built a society where immediate access to goods is considered a fundamental right. The Soviet citizen has been trained in patience, to wait in line, to defer gratification, to accept that consumer desires are subordinate to collective needs. Our vending machines, which promise instant satisfaction, represent a kind of freedom that challenges the Soviet psychological approach to consumption. For American visitors to the USSR, the absence of familiar vending machines became a tangible symbol of Soviet difference. Diplomatic personnel, journalists, and the limited number of tourists permitted behind the Iron Curtain frequently commented on the effort required for even simple purchases. The Soviet shopping experience, fragmented across specialized stores, mediated by clerks, often involving multiple queues, contrasted sharply with the automated convenience Americans increasingly took for granted. John Kenneth Galbraith, the renowned economist who visited the Soviet Union several times during the 1960s, noted how these different approaches to distribution reflected deeper values. The Soviet system demands engagement with other humans for almost every transaction. Whether this represents inefficiency or community depends entirely on your perspective. The American system increasingly allows the consumer to bypass human contact altogether. We consider this efficient. They find it alienating. By the mid-1960s, the initial Soviet fascination with American vending technology had evolved into a more complex response. Official Soviet publications began criticizing vending machines as symbols of American impersonality and alienation. A 1965 article in Literaturnaya Gazeta described American vending machines as mechanical substitutes for human relationships, cold metal boxes that eliminate the need for social interaction during daily activities. This critique reflected a broader Soviet narrative about capitalism's supposedly dehumanizing effects. While acknowledging the convenience of automated vending, Soviet commentators suggested that something essential was lost when commerce became automated, the human connection that supposedly distinguished socialist commerce from its capitalist counterpart. Leonid Brezhnev's ascension to power in 1964 marked the end of Khrushchev's relatively liberal thaw period. The new leadership took a more conservative approach to Western cultural influences, limiting cultural exchanges and emphasizing Soviet achievements over foreign innovations. This shift complicated official attitudes toward Western consumer technologies, including vending machines. The contradictions became increasingly difficult to manage. On one hand, Soviet authorities continued to disparage American consumer culture as superficial and materialistic. On the other hand, they faced growing domestic pressure to improve consumer services and access to goods. Soviet citizens exposed to glimpses of Western convenience through limited travel, foreign films, and cultural exchanges began questioning why similar amenities couldn't be provided within the socialist system. Yuri Andropov, who headed the KGB before eventually becoming Soviet leader, expressed concern in a 1968 memo about the psychological impact of Western consumer technologies. Our citizens increasingly measure our system against Western standards of material provision and convenience. This creates dangerous expectations that socialism may not be able to satisfy in its current form. The late 1960s saw renewed Soviet attempts to develop indigenous vending technology that would provide convenience while maintaining socialist principles. Soviet designers created a range of automated dispensers for newspapers, milk bottles, and baked goods. These machines were deployed experimentally in major cities, particularly Moscow and Leningrad, as part of a broader effort to modernize Soviet retail distribution. These experiments achieved limited success. Mechanical reliability remained a persistent challenge, as did maintenance. Most significantly, the supply chains necessary to keep machines stocked functioned poorly within the rigid Soviet economic planning system. Machines frequently sat empty or broken, reinforcing rather than challenging perceptions of Soviet consumer inadequacy. Viktor Danilov, who worked as a maintenance technician for vending machines in Leningrad during this period, later described the fundamental incompatibility. The vending machine requires constant attention, regular restocking, immediate repair when broken. Our economic system was not designed for this kind of responsiveness. When a machine broke down, getting parts could take weeks. Approval for repairs might require multiple signatures. The technology functioned, but the system surrounding it did not. Meanwhile, in the United States, vending machine culture continued its rapid evolution. By 1970, advanced machines offered hot foods, accepted paper currency, and incorporated increasingly sophisticated refrigeration and heating elements. The vending industry had grown into a $5 billion annual business, employing over 100,000 Americans. Coca-Cola alone operated more than 1 million vending machines nationwide, one machine for approximately every 200 American citizens. This disparity became increasingly visible through cultural exchanges. When the Soviet ice hockey team toured North America in 1972 for the famous Summit Series against Canadian professionals, team members were reportedly fascinated by the ubiquity of vending machines in Canadian arenas and hotels. Several players were photographed purchasing soft drinks and snacks from these machines, images that circulated back in the Soviet Union through sports publications. Soviet authorities faced a dilemma. Acknowledging the convenience of Western vending technology meant admitting a failure of the socialist system to provide equivalent consumer amenities. Yet denying their utility contradicted the Soviet claim that socialism would eventually surpass capitalism in all aspects of material provision. The solution emerged in the form of a compromise that would have significant long-term implications. In 1973, as relations between the United States and Soviet Union entered the détente period, Pepsi-Cola, Coca-Cola's chief rival, negotiated a landmark agreement to become the first American consumer product officially sold in the USSR. The agreement represented a masterpiece of Cold War economic diplomacy. In exchange for bottling rights in the Soviet Union, Pepsi accepted payment in Stolichnaya vodka, which it then distributed in Western markets. This barter arrangement circumvented problems with currency conversion and allowed both sides to claim victory. The Soviets gained access to a prestigious Western product without spending hard currency, while Pepsi secured exclusive access to a market of 240 million consumers, from which its arch-rival Coca-Cola remained excluded. Notably, the Pepsi agreement did not initially include vending machines. The soft drink would be sold through traditional Soviet retail channels, bottled in Soviet factories, and distributed through state stores. The automated self-service component of the American soft drink experience remained absent. Donald Kendall, the Pepsi-Cola CEO who negotiated the historic agreement, understood the symbolic significance. We're not just selling a soft drink, we're introducing a piece of American culture. But we're doing it on terms acceptable to the Soviet system. Evolution, not revolution. For Coca-Cola, the Pepsi deal represented a significant strategic defeat. The company had pioneered global soft drink distribution and had introduced its product to Soviets at the 1959 exhibition, yet now watched as its chief competitor secured exclusive access to the Soviet market. This commercial Cold War between America's soft drink giants added another dimension to the broader geopolitical competition. The Pepsi agreement marked the beginning of a gradual integration of Western consumer products into Soviet life, though strictly on terms dictated by Soviet authorities. Western goods remained scarce, expensive, and often available only through special stores accessible to elites. The fundamental differences in distribution philosophy, automated abundance versus centralized allocation, remained intact. Throughout the 1970s, automated vending in the USSR developed along distinctly Soviet lines. The most successful application emerged in the form of automated cafeterias called automatai that became popular in major cities. Unlike American vending machines designed for individual use on street corners, these were centralized facilities where multiple vending units were grouped together in a single location under staff supervision. Typical Soviet automatai featured a wall of glass-fronted compartments containing prepared foods, sandwiches, salads, pastries. Customers would insert coins to unlock a compartment and remove the item. These systems maintained the Soviet preference for centralization while incorporating limited automation. Significantly, they required staff presence for restocking, maintenance, and oversight, preserving employment while adding convenience. Svetlana Boym, a cultural historian who grew up in Leningrad during this period, described the hybrid nature of these spaces. The automat represented a distinctly Soviet approach to modernization, automation without full self-service, convenience without capitalist individualism. It was a space where technology and ideology reached an uneasy compromise. The introduction of Western products like Pepsi complicated Soviet citizens' relationship with their own consumer system. The presence of a Western soft drink, even when available through traditional Soviet retail channels, raised questions about other aspects of Western consumer culture. If Pepsi could be integrated into Soviet life, why not other Western conveniences? Mikhail Voslensk, a prominent Soviet historian who later defected to the West, noted this tension in his landmark study of Soviet elite privilege, Nomenklatura. Western products created dangerous comparisons. Once Soviet citizens could directly compare Pepsi with Soviet soft drinks, they naturally began questioning other disparities. Access to Western goods became not just a material question, but an ideological one. By the mid-1970s, the symbolic significance of Coca-Cola vending machines had expanded beyond their practical function. In American films and television programs that occasionally reached Soviet audiences, these ubiquitous red machines appeared frequently in background scenes, constant reminders of a consumer landscape fundamentally different from Soviet reality. The machines had become visual shorthand for American abundance and convenience. For Soviet citizens, particularly the younger generation, Western consumer goods increasingly represented not just material objects, but access to a global culture from which they felt excluded. Jeans, rock music albums, and branded soft drinks became coveted not only for their practical value, but as talismans connecting their owners to an international youth culture centered in the West. Vladimir Posner, who worked as an English-language broadcaster for Radio Moscow during this period, before becoming a prominent television journalist, recalled this psychological dimension. The fascination with Western consumer goods was never simply about the products themselves. It was about belonging to a modern global culture. The Coca-Cola logo, whether on a bottle or a vending machine, was a symbol of that belonging. The 1980 Moscow Olympics presented an opportunity for limited expansion of Western consumer amenities in the Soviet capital. Despite the American-led boycott of the Games following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Soviet government authorized unprecedented consumer accommodations for foreign visitors, including dedicated areas where Coca-Cola, now an official Olympic sponsor, could be sold from vending machines. These machines were segregated in areas primarily accessible to foreign tourists and journalists, with most Soviet citizens excluded. This physical separation reinforced the sense that Western consumer conveniences remained foreign intrusions rather than integrated elements of Soviet life. After the Olympics concluded, most of these machines were removed, returning Moscow to its previous state. The early 1980s marked a period of stagnation in Soviet consumer culture. Under the aging leadership of Leonid Brezhnev and his short-lived successors Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, innovation in retail distribution slowed. Existing problems with consumer access worsened as the broader Soviet economy struggled with declining productivity and technological backwardness. Soviet citizens increasingly relied on the shadow economy, unofficial networks of exchange that circumvented state distribution channels. These networks functioned precisely because the official retail system failed to provide desired goods consistently. The contrast with the automated efficiency of American vending culture could not have been starker. For American observers, the absence of vending machines and other self-service technologies in Soviet life served as visible evidence of fundamental system differences. The Reagan administration, which took a more confrontational approach to the Soviet Union than its predecessors, frequently highlighted consumer disparities in its ideological offensive against communism. A 1983 United States Information Agency publication titled A Citizen's Guide to the Soviet Union specifically mentioned the absence of vending machines. The American visitor will notice immediately the lack of automated services that Americans take for granted. Vending machines, when they exist at all, are typically out of order. The concept of self-service, central to American consumer culture, remains largely foreign to Soviet retail practice. This observation captured a fundamental truth about the different trajectories of the competing systems. While American retail continued its evolution toward ever greater automation, with early experiments in electronic payment systems beginning in the late 1970s, Soviet distribution remained labor-intensive, centralized, and increasingly inefficient. The material gap between the systems was becoming impossible to conceal from Soviet citizens. Despite limited access to Western media, information about consumer disparities circulated through personal networks, cultural exchanges, and the accounts of the limited number of Soviet citizens permitted to travel abroad. As the 1980s progressed, pressure for consumer reforms mounted within Soviet society. The system's inability to provide basic consumer conveniences, from reliable food distribution to functional self-service technologies, undermined its legitimacy more effectively than any external criticism could. The arrival of Mikhail Gorbachev as General Secretary in 1985 marked a decisive turning point. Younger and more reform-minded than his predecessors, Gorbachev recognized that the Soviet system required fundamental restructuring to remain viable. His twin policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, created space for unprecedented examination of Soviet consumer inadequacies and experimentation with Western commercial practices. Gorbachev had personal experience with Western consumer culture, having visited several European countries as a rising party official. According to his foreign policy advisor Anatoly Cherniev, Gorbachev had been particularly struck by the efficiency of Western retail during a 1984 visit to the United Kingdom. He was impressed not by luxury, but by convenience, how ordinary people could access goods without the bureaucratic complications we had built into our system. As restrictions on cultural exchange loosened under glasnost, Soviet citizens gained greater exposure to Western consumer norms. Foreign films no longer faced the same censorship. Western publications circulated more freely and increased tourism in both directions, facilitated direct comparison between systems. The ubiquitous Coca-Cola vending machine, a background feature in countless American films and television shows, became increasingly familiar to Soviet viewers. In 1987, as part of Gorbachev's economic reforms, the Soviet government passed the law on cooperatives, which permitted limited forms of private enterprise for the first time since the 1920s. This legislation created opportunities for Soviet entrepreneurs to experiment with new retail formats, including limited self-service technologies modeled on Western examples. Among the early cooperative entrepreneurs was Vladimir Dovgin, who established a network of self-service bakeries in Moscow. Dovgin later recalled the psychological impact of his automated display cases. People were amazed that they could simply open a case and take a product without asking permission from a clerk. This small act of consumer autonomy represented something profound, a new relationship between the citizen and the commercial environment. These domestic experiments coincided with cautious opening to Western consumer brands. Building on the earlier Pepsi precedent, McDonald's began negotiations in the mid-1980s to open its first Soviet restaurant. After years of complex negotiations, the fast food giant opened its flagship location on Moscow's Pushkin Square in January 1990, an event that would become a powerful symbol of changing times. The McDonald's opening drew enormous crowds, with over 30,000 Muscovites waiting hours for their first taste of American fast food. While not featuring vending machines per se, McDonald's introduced Soviet consumers to a highly standardized, efficient service model that contrasted sharply with traditional Soviet catering. The restaurant's consistent quality, quick service, and smiling staff represented a consumer experience as foreign to Soviet norms as any vending machine. George Cohon, the McDonald's executive who spearheaded the Soviet expansion, understood the symbolic dimension. We weren't just selling hamburgers, we were selling a service philosophy. The idea that the customer deserves consistency, courtesy, and convenience was revolutionary in the Soviet context. The late 1980s also saw renewed interest from Coca-Cola in entering the Soviet market, challenging Pepsi's exclusive position. In 1988, Coca-Cola signed a preliminary agreement to sell its products in the USSR, though full implementation would be delayed by the accelerating political crisis of the Soviet system. As the Soviet Union entered its final years, the contrast between Western and Soviet retail practices became a potent symbol of system failure. For many Soviet citizens, the absence of basic consumer conveniences, from well-stocked stores to functional vending machines, represented not just material deprivation, but a fundamental disrespect for their time and dignity. Boris Yeltsin's famous unscheduled visit to an American supermarket during his 1989 trip to Texas became emblematic of this realization. So the future Russian president was reportedly overwhelmed by the abundance and variety of goods available to ordinary Americans. While the specific technologies of distribution were secondary to the products themselves, the encounter highlighted the comprehensive failure of the Soviet consumer system relative to its American counterpart. Georgy Arbatov, a senior Soviet foreign policy advisor who accompanied Yeltsin on several foreign trips, later described the psychological impact of such exposures. Our leaders would return from these visits convinced that our system had failed at the most basic level, providing for citizens' everyday needs. The gap was too large to be explained away by ideological differences. It represented a fundamental failure of our economic model. As political restrictions loosened in the final years of the Soviet Union, Western companies accelerated their entry into the Soviet market. Coca-Cola expanded its presence, though still primarily through traditional retail channels rather than vending machines. The logistical challenges of operating modern vending machines, reliable power, regular maintenance, security from vandalism, efficient restocking, remained daunting in the deteriorating infrastructure of late Soviet cities. The August 1991 coup attempt against Gorbachev, though ultimately unsuccessful, accelerated the Soviet Union's collapse. By December 1991, the USSR had formally dissolved, replaced by 15 independent republics. This political transformation created new opportunities for Western consumer brands and technologies to enter the former Soviet space, now freed from centralized ideological constraints. In post-Soviet Russia and other successor states, the early 1990s witnessed a chaotic transition to market economics. Western consumer goods flooded in, often through unregulated channels. Street kiosks proliferated, offering everything from cigarettes to electronics. These small retail outlets, often literally metal boxes on sidewalks, represented an ironic inversion of the vending machine concept. Instead of automated dispensers selling standardized products, human vendors operated from standardized metal enclosures. Alexander Lebedev, who became one of Russia's prominent businessmen during this period, described the psychological dimension of this consumer revolution. After decades of shortages and drabness, people were intoxicated by access to Western goods. The colorful packaging, the foreign brand names, these became symbols of entering the modern world after years of isolation. Coca-Cola moved aggressively to establish dominance in the post-Soviet market, investing over $750 million in bottling facilities and distribution networks between 1991 and 1995. The company's red logo quickly became ubiquitous in Russian cities, appearing on kiosks, stores, and billboards, a visual manifestation of capitalism's arrival. Vending machines, however, remained relatively rare in the immediate post-Soviet period. The infrastructure challenges remained significant. Unreliable electricity, risk of vandalism, maintenance difficulties, and the absence of a developed service industry to support automated retail. More fundamentally, the economic chaos of the early transition period meant that few operators could afford the capital investment required for modern vending equipment. Alexei Zhukov, who attempted to establish a vending machine business in Moscow in 1993, described these obstacles. The machines themselves we could import, but everything around them was problematic. Security was a major issue. Machines would be vandalized or broken into. The electrical supply was unreliable. Getting machines serviced when they broke down was nearly impossible. And consumers were unfamiliar with the concept. They would shake or hit the machines when they didn't work as expected. By the mid-1990s, as Russia's economic situation began to stabilize, Western-style retail formats expanded in major cities. Supermarkets, shopping centers, and chain stores gradually replaced the chaotic kiosk commerce of the immediate post-Soviet period. These new retail environments created more suitable conditions for vending technology to develop. Coca-Cola vending machines began appearing in controlled environments, airports, hotels catering to international visitors, and Western-style shopping centers. Their presence remained largely confined to these protected spaces where security, electrical reliability, and maintenance could be assured. On ordinary Russian street corners, the iconic red machines remained conspicuously absent. This limited deployment created a new form of consumer stratification. Access to automated convenience, the ability to purchase a cold drink from a machine without human interaction, became associated with privileged spaces catering to elites and foreigners. The vending machine, once a symbol of American democratic consumption available to all citizens regardless of status, functioned in post-Soviet Russia as a marker of exclusive Western space. Olga Krishtanovskaya, a sociologist who studied Russia's post-Soviet elite, noted this dimension. The new consumer landscape was highly stratified. Western amenities like vending machines existed primarily in spaces accessible to the new business class and foreigners. Ordinary Russians continued to shop through traditional channels with human intermediaries. Consumer convenience became another form of privilege. By the late 1990s, economic stabilization and growing middle-class purchasing power created conditions for broader adoption of vending technology. Russian entrepreneurs began establishing domestic vending operations, often focusing on hot beverages, coffee and tea, rather than cold drinks, reflecting local preferences and climate conditions. Dmitry Zhuykov founded one of Russia's first successful vending companies in 1998, focusing on coffee machines in office buildings. He recalled the initial challenges. We were selling not just coffee but a concept, the idea that a machine could reliably produce a good cup of coffee without human intervention. This required overcoming deep skepticism based on previous experiences with Soviet automation, which had generally been poor. Western vending machine manufacturers recognized the emerging opportunity in Russia and other post-Soviet markets. Companies like Necta, Seiko, and Dixie Narco began establishing distribution networks and service operations to support their equipment. These manufacturers adapted their machines to local conditions, reinforcing cabinets against vandalism, incorporating more robust power management systems to handle electrical fluctuations, and designing coin mechanisms compatible with the rapidly changing post-Soviet currencies. The 1998 Russian financial crisis temporarily halted this development as collapsing purchasing power and commercial uncertainty made capital investments in vending equipment impractical. However, the economic recovery that began under Vladimir Putin's presidency created conditions for renewed expansion of automated retail technologies. By the early 2000s, vending machines had established a presence in Russian urban life, though in a pattern distinctly different from the American model. Rather than standing alone on street corners, the iconic American deployment, Russian vending machines typically appeared in clusters within controlled environments, shopping centers, office buildings, transit stations, and educational institutions. This pattern reflected both security concerns and the different rhythm of Russian urban life, which featured less automobile dependence and more centralized commercial activity than American cities. Coca-Cola vending machines finally achieved widespread deployment in Russia between 2000 and 2005 as part of the company's broader investment in the Russian market. The machines arrived in a social context vastly different from their 1959 introduction to Soviet citizens. For the post-Soviet generation, Coca-Cola was already a familiar product available through conventional retail channels. The vending machine represented a convenience rather than an ideological revelation. Elena Viktorova, who researched consumer behavior at Moscow State University during this period, observed this changed relationship. For the generation that remembered Soviet times, these machines still carried a symbolic weight. They represented the fulfillment of a long-delayed promise of consumer convenience. For younger Russians who had grown up after the Soviet collapse, they were simply a useful service, judged on practical terms rather than as symbols of a different economic system. This generational divide in perception extended to broader attitudes toward automation in daily life. Older Russians, formed by Soviet experiences, often expressed preference for human service, viewing automation with suspicion based on memories of poorly functioning Soviet technology. Younger consumers, more influenced by global consumer norms, typically embraced self-service technologies as modern and efficient. Sergei Karaganov, a prominent Russian foreign policy analyst, noted how this divide reflected broader social attitudes. The question of whether to get your Coca-Cola from a human clerk or an automated machine might seem trivial, but it reflected deeper orientations toward modernity, efficiency, and social relations. The generational divide on this issue mirrored broader divisions in Russian society regarding Westernization and tradition. By 2005, Moscow and St. Petersburg featured approximately one vending machine per 1,500 residents, a significant increase from the post-Soviet period, but still far below the American ratio of one machine per 40-50 residents. The distribution remained highly concentrated in affluent urban areas, with minimal penetration into smaller cities and rural regions. For American visitors to Russia during this period, the limited presence of familiar vending machines often served as a visible reminder of persistent differences between the consumer landscapes of the former Cold War rivals. Despite the penetration of Western brands into the Russian market, the physical infrastructure of consumption, how goods were distributed and accessed, retained distinctive characteristics shaped by the Soviet legacy. Thomas Graham, who served as Senior Director for Russia on the U.S. National Security Council during the early 2000s, observed this continuing distinction. Visitors from either country could immediately sense the difference in consumer environments. Despite the presence of many of the same global brands, the physical organization of retail, including the presence or absence of automated services, remained distinctively American or Russian. These differences reflected not just economic development, but deeper cultural attitudes towards service, efficiency, and public space. As Russia's economy strengthened during the resource-driven boom of the 2000s, vending technology diversified beyond beverages. New machine types appeared offering snacks, small electronics, personal care items, and even hot foods. Russian entrepreneurs developed indigenous vending concepts adapted to local preferences and conditions. Particularly successful were hot beverage machines offering a wide variety of coffee preparations and tea options, reflecting Russia's strong hot beverage culture. These machines, often manufactured in Italy but programmed for Russian preferences, became common features in office buildings, universities, and transportation hubs. Mikhail Krasnov established one of Russia's largest vending operations during this period, focusing on hot beverage machines in corporate environments. He identified a distinctly Russian approach to the technology. We discovered that our customers wanted more options, more customization, than typical Western machines offered. Where an American machine might offer 3 or 4 coffee variations, our machines needed to provide 10 or 15, including multiple tea options. This reflected a different relationship with hot beverages in our culture. The mid-2000s also witnessed the emergence of specialized vending technologies unique to the Russian market. Particularly notable were payment terminals, kiosk-style machines that accepted cash payments for mobile phone services, internet access, and utilities. These machines, which proliferated rapidly throughout Russian cities, represented a hybrid form that combined automated technology with the cash-based economic reality of many Russian consumers who lacked access to electronic payment methods. QYYY, founded in 2004, became the dominant provider of these payment terminals, eventually operating over 100,000 machines across Russia. The company's success demonstrated how vending technology could be adapted to local conditions and needs, rather than simply transplanted from Western models. Andrei Romanenko, Kiwi's co-founder, explicitly recognized this adaptation. We created an automated solution for a specifically Russian problem: how to incorporate the cash economy into digital services. This wasn't copying a Western model, but developing something suited to our particular circumstances. The global financial crisis of 2008-2009 slowed, but did not reverse the expansion of vending technology in Russia. As the economy recovered, deployment resumed, increasingly supported by improved electronic payment infrastructure. The introduction of reliable cellular data networks enabled remote monitoring and management of vending machines, addressing one of the key operational challenges that had previously limited expansion. By 2010, Moscow's vending machine density approached Western European levels in central districts, though with a distribution pattern that remained distinctly Russian, concentrated in indoor locations rather than on street corners. The iconic image of the Coca-Cola vending machine on an American street corner remained relatively uncommon in Russia, reflecting different patterns of urban design, security concerns, and climate considerations. The early 2010s saw accelerated adoption of electronic payment methods in Russia, creating new possibilities for vending technology. Contactless payment cards, mobile payment applications, and improved network infrastructure made cashless vending increasingly viable. These developments addressed one of the persistent challenges in the Russian market, the security risks associated with cash-based vending operations. Alexander Polyakov, who developed payment systems for the Russian vending industry during this period, described this transition. The shift to electronic payments transformed the economics of vending. Machine operators no longer needed to worry about cash theft, which had been a major deterrent to street placement. This opened new possibilities for deploying machines in less controlled environments. Political tensions between Russia and the West following the 2014 annexation of Crimea complicated but did not fundamentally alter the trajectory of Western consumer technologies in Russia. While some Western companies reduced investments in response to sanctions and counter-sanctions, established consumer brands like Coca-Cola maintained their Russian operations, including vending machine networks. By 2015, vending technology in major Russian cities had achieved a level of sophistication comparable to Western markets, though with distinctive local characteristics. The total Russian vending market reached approximately 165,000 machines nationwide, significant growth from the early post-Soviet period, but still representing just one-tenth the density of the American market on a per capita basis. This disparity reflected continuing differences in consumer behavior, payment infrastructure, and retail organization. The vending machine, perhaps especially the Coca-Cola vending machine, remained a technology whose deployment revealed deeper social and economic patterns that distinguished the post-Soviet market from its American counterpart. Valeria Casamara, who researched consumer culture at Moscow's Higher School of Economics, observed, "The different trajectories of vending technology in America and Russia reflect not just economic development, but fundamental social attitudes. Americans pioneered this technology because it aligned with core cultural values: efficiency, convenience, individualism, minimal human interaction. Russians have adopted it selectively in patterns that reflect our different priorities: social interaction, cultural specificity, adaptation to existing urban patterns." The COVID-19 pandemic, beginning in 2020, created new interest in contactless retail technologies, including advanced vending systems. In both Russia and the United States, operators reported increased consumer preference for automated options that minimized human contact. This convergent pressure accelerated the adoption of touchless interfaces and mobile payment options in vending equipment across markets. Looking back from our present vantage point in 2025, the story of the Coca-Cola vending machine in Soviet and post-Soviet space offers a remarkable lens through which to view the intersection of technology, ideology, and everyday life across the long arc of the Cold War and its aftermath. What began as a cultural shock, Soviet citizens encountering self-service Coca-Cola dispensers at the 1959 American exhibition, evolved through decades of adaptation, resistance, and eventually selective incorporation. The vending machine, seemingly the most mundane of technologies, revealed profound differences in how competing systems approached the organization of daily life. In contemporary Russia, the automated dispensing of consumer products has found its place, neither rejected as ideologically incompatible, nor embraced with the enthusiasm that characterized American adoption. The technology has been adapted to local conditions, preferences, and social patterns, creating a distinctly Russian approach to automated retail that reflects the complex legacy of the Soviet experience. For older Russians who remember their first encounter with a Coca-Cola vending machine, whether at the 1959 exhibition or during the post-Soviet transition, these devices continue to carry symbolic weight beyond their practical function. They represent not just a convenient way to purchase a cold drink, but a tangible connection to the long journey from Soviet shortages to post-Soviet consumer society. Mikhail Gorbachev, reflecting on this journey shortly before his death in 2022, observed, "The transformation of our society can be measured in many ways: political freedom, institutional development, economic indicators, but sometimes the smallest things tell the largest stories." The journey from our citizens marveling at a Coca-Cola machine in 1959 to such machines becoming ordinary features of Russian life, this reveals everything about the path we have traveled. The story of the Coca-Cola vending machine in Russia reminds us that technological adoption is never simply a matter of practical functionality. Technologies carry cultural meanings shaped by historical context. They arrive not as neutral tools, but as embodiments of the societies that created them, carrying implicit values and assumptions about how daily life should be organized. In the case of the vending machine, these embedded values included assumptions about self-service, immediate gratification, standardization, and the elimination of human intermediaries in commercial transactions. These values aligned naturally with American consumer culture, but required significant adaptation in the Soviet and post-Soviet context. What makes this story particularly revealing is the mundane nature of its subject. Unlike space technology, nuclear weapons, or computer systems, the dramatic technologies that dominated Cold War competition, the vending machine represented everyday innovation. Its significance lay precisely in its ordinariness, how it transformed the most basic commercial interactions of daily life. As we consider the broader history of Cold War technological competition, this perspective offers a valuable counterbalance to narratives focused exclusively on military and strategic technologies. The battle for hearts and minds was fought not just through weapons systems and space races, but through the organization of everyday experiences, including something as seemingly trivial as how a citizen obtained a cold beverage on a warm day. The Coca-Cola vending machine's journey from American streets to Soviet exhibition to contemporary Russian shopping centers traces the complex path of globalization itself, the selective adoption, adaptation, and transformation of technologies and practices across cultural boundaries. It reminds us that globalization has never been a simple process of Western models replacing local alternatives, but rather a complex negotiation between different approaches to organizing social and economic life. As we look toward future technological transformations, from artificial intelligence to automated retail systems far more sophisticated than the mechanical dispensers of the Cold War era, this history offers valuable perspective. Technologies never arrive as neutral tools. They embody specific visions of how society should function. Their adoption and adaptation reveal not just economic calculations, but deeper values and social priorities. The humble Coca-Cola vending machine, in its journey from American innovation to Soviet curiosity to global ubiquity, demonstrates how the smallest aspects of daily life can reveal the largest historical transformations. In the encounter between Soviet citizens and American vending machines, we glimpse not just different approaches to soft drink distribution, but competing visions of modernity itself, alternative answers to the fundamental question of how society should organize the satisfaction of human needs and desires.